The year was 1769. The American colonies, still firmly under the rule of the British Crown, were restless, but not yet ablaze with revolution. However, something far more insidious than political discontent had begun to spread through the settlements. It started as whispers: farmers who didn't return from the woods, trappers whose camps were found empty, save for blood-stained snow. At first, the explanations were simple. Natives seeking retribution, remnants of the French seeking to reclaim lost territory, or even rogue Spanish explorers drifting too far north. But none of these accusations fit what was left behind. The first real sign that something unnatural was at work came from the frontier towns. A patrol sent from Albany to investigate a missing family found their cabin intact, fire still crackling in the hearth, supper set out on the wooden table, but no sign of its occupants. There was no struggle, no footprints leading away, nothing but the gnawed carcass of a deer discarded just beyond the tree line. The hunters were puzzled, but assumed a bear had scavenged the meal and the family had fled deeper into the wilderness. They were wrong. By late autumn, disappearances had escalated. Livestock were found with their throats torn open, their bodies untouched by scavengers. Merchants traveling between settlements began reporting sightings of figures in the woods, pale and gaunt, their movements unnaturally fast, their eyes reflecting the light of torches like those of a beast. And then came the stories of the voices. One evening, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a group of men returning from a town meeting swore they heard their wives calling out to them from the trees. But the voices were strange, echoing in an unnatural way, as though the woods themselves spoke. When one of them, Samuel Barrow, stepped toward the sound, the others watched as he simply disappeared. No cry, no struggle. One moment he was there, the next, gone. As winter descended upon the colonies, the vanishings became more gruesome. Blood would be found smeared across the snow, crude symbols drawn in viscera on barn doors, and always, the strange remnants of wild animals half devoured and discarded. The fear grew, and soon, even the most skeptical among the settlers turned to superstition. Some believed it was a curse, an ancient wrath from the land itself, angered by the presence of the colonists. Others whispered of creatures from beyond the veil of the natural world, spirits that did not take kindly to trespassers. Church bells rang through the night, warding off evil. Men armed themselves with silver bullets, though none could explain why. And then there were those who listened to the whispers, who vanished willingly into the darkness, never to be seen again. By early March of 1770, entire villages had gone silent. British authorities, unable to maintain order, sent red-coated patrols into the wilderness, but they too were swallowed by the shadows. In the streets of Boston, talk of liberty and taxation had been momentarily overshadowed by terror until, on the night of March 5th, the sky itself seemed to split open with a thunderous roar. It began like any other protest, the kind that had been growing in frequency over the past few years. Colonists angry over taxation, over soldiers stationed in their streets, over a distant king who knew nothing of their suffering. The crowd gathered before the customs house, their voices a steady wave of defiance against the presence of British troops. The soldiers stood in formation, their muskets held tight, faces tense as they faced the restless mob. Snow fell in thick, wet clumps, sticking to the cobbled streets, soaking through boots, but the cold did nothing to quell the fire in the protesters' eyes. Then came the screams. Not from the soldiers. Not from the protesters. But from the alleys, from the dark spaces between buildings where the torchlight could not reach. They came in a rush, spilling out from the shadows, figures that had once been men but were no longer. Their flesh was torn, some barely clinging to their bones, others blackened and oozing with what could only be decay. And yet they moved, not with the sluggishness of the dead but with the erratic speed of something driven by insatiable hunger. The British soldiers, disciplined as they were, hesitated. They had prepared for an unruly mob, perhaps a riot, not this. The first of the creatures fell upon a young recruit at the end of the line, sinking teeth into his neck, pulling him to the ground. His scream was lost in the chaos as the protesters scattered, some too slow to escape as the things tore into them with inhuman ferocity. The musket fire began in bursts then all at once. Redcoats unleashed their volleys, firing into the oncoming horror, the sharp retorts of their weapons echoing through the narrow streets. But these things did not fall as men did. Some dropped, their skulls split open, their limbs blasted apart, but others did not. They kept coming, clawing, biting, wailing with voices that no longer belonged to the living. By the time it was over, the snow had turned black with blood. The creatures lay strewn about the streets, their broken bodies steaming in the cold. The remaining British soldiers, wide-eyed and shaking, stared at the carnage before them. They had fought many battles in the name of the crown, but never had they seen such horrors. The next day, the newspapers told a different story. Not of the British gunning down colonists in cold blood, but of something much darker. Unholy men put down by king's men, one read. Creatures from the grave slain in Boston streets, said another. Some refused to believe it, claimed it was British propaganda, an excuse for their violence. But those who had been there, those who had seen the bloodied, ruined faces of the attackers, knew the truth. Something unnatural had come to the colonies. And it was only the beginning. The night of March 5, 1770, was one that would be burned into the minds of every man, woman, and child who lived to tell of it. What began as an ordinary confrontation, colonists jeering at British soldiers, throwing snowballs laced with ice and rock, tensions rising over taxation and occupation, became something else entirely. Something monstrous. The protest had been growing in intensity outside the customs house, just as history would later remember. The British soldiers, rigid and uneasy, their muskets held in uncertain hands, faced down a crowd that refused to disperse. The usual provocations rang out. Cowards! Go back to England where you belong. No king but our own, you red-coated devils. And then the first strike a wooden club against a soldier's shoulder, knocking him slightly off balance. The shouts turned to roars. The people surged forward. That was when the screaming began. It didn't come from the soldiers. It didn't come from the angry colonists. It came from the alleyways, from the places the lamplight barely reached, from the gaps between buildings where the shadows had sat untouched since sundown. Figures staggered into the streets, not just one or two, but dozens. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their limbs twisted at impossible angles, their bodies ravaged by wounds that should have left them cold in the ground. Ragged flesh hung from exposed ribs. Skin blackened as if burned clung to brittle bones. Some were dressed as common laborers, others in the tattered remnants of what might have once been British uniforms from wars long past. At first, the crowd mistook them for men stricken by disease, victims of some terrible affliction dragging themselves into the night's chaos. Then the first one lunged, teeth bared, tearing into the throat of a hapless merchant who had been at the front of the protest. The shriek that followed shattered any illusion that these were men in need of help. The creatures, these things that had once been people, rushed forward like a wave, their mouths gnashing, hands grasping at the living with desperate hunger. The crowd turned to run, but the alleyways they had come from were still vomiting forth more of them, trapping people in the square. The British soldiers, at first stunned into inaction, soon did what they were trained to do. Fire, someone shouted, though no order had been given. The muskets cracked in unison, the lead balls tearing into rotting flesh, but it was no battlefield engagement. The creatures didn't flinch as musket balls punched through their bodies. Some fell only to crawl forward, their hands clawing at boots and legs, dragging screaming men down into the growing pools of blood. Panicked soldiers began using their bayonets, their rifles turned into spears as they drove the steel into sunken chests, slashing at faces twisted into grim mockeries of human expression. The colonists, too, fought back, not against the soldiers, but against whatever these things were. Men who had been cursing the British moments before now found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder with them, swinging clubs, knives, whatever they had at their disposal. By the time it ended, the square was littered with bodies, most of them already dead before the night even began. The newspapers the next morning did not accuse the British of massacre. No calls of tyranny rang out in the broadsheets. Instead, the reports read with confusion, with disbelief, with terror. Horrors among us. British soldiers fell the walking dead in Boston's streets. Creatures of rot and ruin attacked the Crown's garrison. Men who should not have walked among us found among the dead. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was it a plague? A curse? Had something clawed its way up from the very ground beneath Boston? And perhaps most chillingly, how many more were still out there, waiting in the shadows? the colonies would never be the same again. The usual cries of no taxation without representation became secondary to something far more pressing: the question of survival. The spark of rebellion still burned, but now, it was fueled by more than the weight of British rule. It was fueled by fear. Fear of the things that lurked in the dark, fear of the strange affliction that took the bodies of men and returned them as something wrong. The Boston Massacre, as it was already being whispered about, was not remembered as an act of British aggression but as the first real battle against them, whatever they were. In the days that followed, the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, attempted to downplay the event, but the people of Boston would not forget. Even among the British ranks, there were murmurs. Soldiers began to desert, terrified of what they had fought. And those who stayed demanded new weapons, new protection: silver shot, sharpened blades, things that might stand a chance against an enemy that did not fall like a man. The colonies, divided between loyalists and patriots before, were now forced into a grim unity. A new enemy had entered the battlefield, and neither allegiance to the crown nor the dream of independence made one immune to its grasp. The British military, under orders from Parliament, declared martial law in Boston, fearing both the unrest of the people and the spread of whatever this curse was. Yet, whispers from other colonies began to spread. Vanished families in the Carolinas. Ships arriving in Philadelphia with no crew aboard. Strange shapes moving at night in the Virginia countryside. Blood in the rivers of New York. This was no isolated event. By the summer of 1770, something had changed. Militias that once trained to fight the British were now training for something else. Redcoats and colonial rangers alike patrolled the edges of towns not just for deserters or rebels, but for the other threats that lurked just beyond the tree line. The Sons of Liberty, already a secretive organization, began speaking in hushed tones about the real war, the one no one wanted to admit was happening. Revolution had always been coming. The injustices of the crown still pressed down on the colonies, the weight of distant rule still intolerable. But now, the reasons were shifting. This was no longer just about freedom. This was about survival. And when the war finally came, it would not just be fought with muskets and cannons. It would be fought in the dead of night, against enemies that did not wear uniforms. It would be fought in abandoned farmsteads, in the ruins of settlements that disappeared overnight. It would be fought in the very streets of colonial cities, where the shadows whispered and the dead did not stay buried. The American Revolution had begun. But the war for humanity's survival had already started. The frontier had always been dangerous, but never like this. The promise of the West, of untouched land and freedom from the chaos gripping the colonies, was quickly turning into something else, something wrong. By late 1770, caravans of desperate families, fur traders, and ambitious explorers had begun pushing westward, hoping to outrun whatever horror had taken root in the colonies. But the further they traveled, the more they saw the signs. The first reports were whispered among the guides, the men who had long lived at the edge of civilization, the ones who had seen what lurked beyond the known world. They spoke of things found in caves along the ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, tucked into the deep, craggy ravines, or left half buried in the dirt where rivers cut through the land. The first body found was mistaken for a recent tragedy. A man, skin gray with death, sunken eyes still staring at the sky, mouth frozen in an eternal scream. But his clothing was wrong. His boots, cracked and worn, were sewn in a way no Englishman had done in generations. His belt was fastened with an old iron clasp, rusted beyond repair. A locket, still hanging around his neck, bore a name that no one recognized, engraved in a language few had even seen. Then they found another, and another. At first, they assumed these were the remains of some lost people, perhaps travelers who had come before them, who had never made it out. But the more they looked, the more impossible it became. These were not the remains of pioneers or natives. These were bodies that should have been hundreds, maybe thousands of years old, but they were not the dried husks of history. They were fresh. Their skin still pulled against their bones, their muscles still clung to sinew. Some still had blood in their veins, dark and thick like tar. Yet their belongings were ancient, older than the land itself. One group of scouts, venturing too deep into a cavern system along the Ohio River, came back changed. When they had gone in, they had been a band of 6. When they returned, they were only 2. And one of the men who had made it out, he never spoke again. He just sat by the fire at night, staring at the sky, whispering things under his breath that no one understood. The other survivor said nothing at first, just kept drinking, night after night, until he finally gave in and told his story. They weren't dead. His voice trembled. We found them in the dark, just lying there, like they'd been waiting for us. They had thought they were just more corpses, like the others, until one of the men had stepped too close. He had nudged one with his boot, rolling the body onto its back. And then it breathed. They weren't dead. Not all the way. The men had panicked. They had fired their muskets into the dark. The sound of gunfire echoed through the caves, but something else answered back. A noise. A sound that they swore didn't belong to any creature of God or man. They ran. They didn't look back. And when they finally reached the surface, gasping for air, shaking with terror, they realized they had left behind more than just the others. The cave had not been empty when they had arrived. And it was not empty when they fled. More stories followed. A group of trappers in the Great Lakes territory found a frozen corpse sitting upright in the snow, eyes wide open, teeth clenched together as though he had died in agony. His clothes were wrong, sewn together with sinew, the stitching crude and ancient. The meat of his body had not frozen solid as it should have in the cold, it had rotted. But his eyes, his eyes were still wet. A French fur trader wrote in his journal that he had seen something stalking the forests near the Mississippi, something that had the shape of a man but was not a man. It had moved like it had only just remembered how to walk. It had turned its head toward him in a slow, deliberate motion, its neck creaking like an old door hinge. He had run. He had not stopped running until his lungs burned and his feet bled. By the winter of 1771, the westward expansion had slowed. People still fled the colonies, but now they did not speak of the West as a land of promise. Now, the rumors painted a different picture. Something was waiting out there. Something that had been there long before the first settlers had ever arrived. Something ancient. Something that would not die. By 1773, the colonies were no longer just simmering with frustration, they were boiling with rage. The British had proven time and time again that their only concern was order, not survival. The Crown had no interest in diverting resources to deal with the horrors plaguing the settlements, nor did it acknowledge the unnatural nature of the threat. To the British, these were mere disturbances to be controlled, quarantined, or ignored altogether. This was the breaking point. Settlers had spent years fighting for their lives against the dead, against the things that lurked in the forests and caves, against horrors that had no name. And where was the British Army? Enforcing laws. Cracking down on militia activity. Guarding the ports to ensure that taxes were collected. While men and women bled in the streets of their own towns, the king's forces were more concerned with trade than with the survival of their own subjects. People started asking questions. Dangerous questions. Why do we call ourselves British if Britain won't protect us? Why should we answer to a king who won't even answer our cries for help? What good is a government across the sea when it does nothing but take, while we are the ones fighting to keep these colonies alive? The British response was as cold as ever. They refused to acknowledge the reality of the situation. When towns went silent, the reports dismissed them as isolated incidents. When British patrols vanished, their commanders simply sent more. When entire militias rose up to defend against an enemy they barely understood, the redcoats branded them as rebels and criminals. No one knew what these creatures were, what to call them, what to do with them. But they knew this: the British weren't going to stop them. So the colonists decided to stop them themselves. This was no longer just about independence, it was about survival. In taverns and meeting halls, in churches and town squares, whispers turned into rallying cries. The Sons of Liberty, once known for smuggling and political agitation, now found themselves becoming something else entirely: leaders in a war for humanity itself. Men like Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, and Patrick Henry were no longer just speaking of revolution in terms of sovereignty. Now, they spoke of a war for the very right to exist. In Virginia, militias began drilling not just against British troops, but against the others, testing weapons, fortifying towns, preparing as best they could. In New York, a group of hunters, frontiersmen, and ex-soldiers formed what they called the Watchmen, swearing an oath to eliminate whatever had begun crawling out of the wilderness. In Boston, where the massacre had first revealed these horrors to the world, men and women alike began whispering in secret about a new kind of rebellion, one that did not just seek freedom, but vengeance against whatever had been let loose in their land. Meanwhile, in Parliament, the discussions about the colonies were laughable to those who lived in them. Lords and bureaucrats scoffed at reports of phantoms in the woods and undying men roaming the countryside. Some believed it was nothing but colonial superstition. Others believed it was all a political ploy, a desperate trick to stir rebellion against the crown. The British solution? Send more troops. Crack down harder. Smother the colonies before they could rise up. But this was not just another tax revolt. This was not just about sovereignty or governance. This was about life or death. By 1775, when British soldiers marched to Lexington and Concord to seize colonial weapons and crush the growing rebellion, they expected a swift victory. They did not expect to find a nation already at war with the dead. And when the first shots of the revolution rang out, they were not just shots fired against an empire. They were shots fired against the unknown. The morning of April 19, 1775, should have been the day the British stamped out a rebellion before it could begin. Instead, it became the day the colonies abandoned the crown to its fate. The Redcoats had marched from Boston in the early hours, muskets gleaming in the faint light of dawn, their mission clear: seize colonial weapons, arrest the instigators, and remind these so-called Americans who ruled them. But as they marched, the citizens who watched them from the roadsides did not cower. They did not stand silent. Instead, they screamed at them. "Where were you when my father was taken in the night? Where was your king when my children never came home? You think we are the enemy? Take a look at the woods, you fools." At first, the British ignored them. Orders were orders. But as they entered the town of Lexington, their reception grew worse. The militia had gathered not to resist, but to make a statement. They had been fighting these horrors for years, had given up their livelihoods, their families, their very way of life to protect what they had left. And now the British had the audacity to march on them instead of the real threat. The British major leading the troops ordered the militia to stand down. The Americans simply laughed. "No, Major. You stand down." The tension broke in Concord. By the time the British reached the second town, the road was lined with people, not warriors, not soldiers, but survivors. Men, women, children, people who had lost family, had fought in the night, had seen things they could never forget. And they hated the Redcoats for refusing to believe, for refusing to help, for pretending this was still about taxes and laws when it had never been about that at all. The mob began throwing whatever they had. Rocks, rotten food, bloodied bones of the creatures they had slain. the British formation held at first. But then, the militia made their final decision. The British wanted to prove they could handle the colonies. Fine. Let them. The Americans left. In an act of pure defiance, the militia turned their backs on the king's army, gathering the townsfolk and simply evacuating them. They took the carts, the food, the weapons, everything, leaving the British alone in Lexington and Concord, alone with what lived in the forests. And the creatures were waiting. As the last American wagons rolled away, the first screams rang out from the tree-line. At first, the British thought it was an ambush. That was, until they saw the things coming out of the woods. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. They moved in unnatural ways, some crawling, some shambling, some running like animals set loose. Some still wore British coats, their uniforms rotting on their frames, their mouths hanging open in silent agony. The redcoats panicked. Some fired immediately. Others froze, watching as things that should not be alive closed in on them. The first line of British soldiers fell in seconds, ripped apart before they could even reload. Blood splattered the cobbled streets of Concord as musket fire rang out in every direction, soldiers screaming, bayonets clashing against clawed hands. From the hills outside town, the Americans watched in silence. Lexington and Concord belonged to the British now. And the British belonged to the dead. The American Revolution had begun. But so had something much, much worse. By the time British reinforcements reached Philadelphia in late 1775, the city was already ready for them, but not in the way they expected. From the shores of England, the reports had been simple: the colonists have attacked British troops. The rebellion has begun. The truth, however, was far worse. The Americans had not attacked. They had left the British to die. And they had good reason. The British had ignored them, had mocked them, had continued to see this as a petty tax revolt instead of what it was, a war against something unnatural. And because of that ignorance, because of their refusal to believe, Lexington and Concord had become a feeding ground. Now, months later, the British response had finally arrived in force. A fleet of ships, bristling with cannon and packed with thousands of red-coated reinforcements, rolled into the harbor. Order would be restored. The rebels would be crushed. That was their mission. That was the lie they still told themselves. But as their ships pulled into the Delaware River, they saw something unexpected. Crowds. Tens of thousands of civilians and militia had gathered along the docks. Not as an army. Not in battle lines. But as an unmovable wall of fury. They held banners. Some waved the colors of the colonies. Others held remnants of the things they had slain: rotting heads on pikes, severed limbs, skulls turned into grim warnings. And when the first ship began its approach, the shouting began. Turn back. You do not land here unless you listen. We do not need your soldiers. We need you to fight with US. The British commanders, watching from the decks, scoffed. They saw the crowd, not for what it was, a desperate people making a final plea, but as an insult to the crown. Their orders were clear. The colonies were in open rebellion, and rebels were to be put down. So, without warning, the first ship fired. The crash of the cannon was deafening. The first volley tore through the crowd, shattering bodies, splintering wood, sending blood and screams into the air. Chaos erupted. The Americans scrambled back, their demand for peace answered with gunpowder and death. But what the British failed to understand, what they hadn't learned from Concord, was this: noise attracts them. The moment the cannons fired, the city stirred. The dead, hidden in the ruins, awoke. At first, it was just one scream, somewhere deep within Philadelphia's winding streets. Then another. Then dozens. Then they came. The dead poured from alleyways, from shattered buildings, from beneath the very docks, crawling up from the water like bloated horrors that had never stopped drowning. The British saw the threat too late. The Americans, they were already leaving. With calculated efficiency, the militia and citizens abandoned the docks, dispersing into the rooftops where they had prepared for this very moment. They did not stand and fight on the ground. They let the British deal with their own stupidity. The redcoats, in their rigid formations, tried to hold their ground. They formed their musket lines. They fired. They fired again. But it did not matter. The dead did not stop. The first ranks were ripped apart in seconds, the front lines collapsing into blood and chaos. Bayonets were useless for every creature they skewered. 2 more dragged men screaming into the horde. Soldiers trying to retreat were pushed forward by their own officers, commanded to hold their ground when there was no ground left to hold. The Americans watched from above, silent. And when the time was right, they began their own attack. From the rooftops, objects rained down, muskets fired from above, arrows loosed into the masses, knives and axes dropped into the fray. The British, trapped, caught between a wall of undead and an unseen enemy above, died screaming. The ships in the harbor tried to flee, but there was no one left to command them. The captains, the officers, had all disembarked. And now, their ships stood silent in the bloodied water, waiting to be taken. By nightfall, Philadelphia belonged to the Americans. The British, they belonged to the dead. By early 1776, the colonies had had enough. The British refused to listen. They refused to see. They continued to believe this was just another rebellion, another tax revolt, another political crisis that could be crushed with more troops, more ships, more force. The Americans had warned them. They had pleaded with them. They had tried, time and time again, to show them the truth. And every time, the British had answered with violence. So now, the Americans would answer back. The plan was reckless. It was dangerous. It was exactly what was needed. A ship was chosen, an old British man of war, captured during one of the countless skirmishes on the coast. It had seen better days, but it still floated, still had its guns, still had the proud markings of His Majesty's Royal Navy. A ship that, from a distance, would be recognized as one of their own. And into its belly, the Americans loaded a new kind of weapon. The dead. Not just a few. Not just a handful. Hundreds. It had taken weeks to wrangle them, to corral them without losing too many men. The process was brutal, baiting them into cages, trapping them with fire, forcing them into the ship's hold like cattle bound for slaughter. Some were ancient, still wrapped in rags from civilizations long gone. Others were British soldiers, once loyal to the crown, now nothing but gnashing teeth and hunger. When the final latch was sealed, the ship was set to sail. A small crew, all of them doomed men, guided it toward the Atlantic. They had volunteered, knowing they would never return, knowing that their final act would change the world forever. And as the men of war vanished over the horizon, a single lantern burned at the bow, a grim beacon, guiding death itself toward England's shores. The arrival, the British Isles, early spring 1776. The ship drifted into Portsmouth Harbor like any other returning vessel of the Royal Navy. At first, the dockhands paid it no mind. Another warship back from the colonies, no doubt carrying dispatches, supplies, perhaps even prisoners. No one questioned it. Not until they realized the sails were torn. Not until they saw the deck, empty and silent. Not until they boarded the vessel, and found no crew. The gangplank dropped. The hold was opened. And they came out. A flood of bodies, clawing, snarling, mindless with hunger, pouring onto the docks like a biblical plague set loose upon the British homeland. Soldiers and dock workers alike were overwhelmed in seconds, their screams swallowed by the sheer number of them. Panic spread immediately. The garrison stationed at the harbor attempted to form ranks, to hold the line, but they were just as blind as their commanders across the sea. They fought them like men, not realizing they were not men at all. Musket fire did little. Bayonets did less. One officer, in sheer desperation, ordered the cannons turned on the city itself, hoping to burn the tide of horrors before they could escape the docks. But it was already too late. Portsmouth fell. The infection spread. Within days, it reached London. By the time the king received word, his empire was already burning. A three-way war. There was no going back now. Britain had dismissed the colonies as disobedient children. Now, they were fighting for their very survival. The British Isles, once untouchable, were now drenched in blood. and the men who had once ruled the world from their palaces and parliaments found themselves barricaded in their own cities, fighting against an enemy they had refused to believe in. The American War of Independence. It was now a global war for survival. The British, arrogant and unprepared, still clung to their traditional war tactics, still threw men at the problem, still refused to learn. The Americans. They had been fighting the dead for years. And they knew something the British still didn't understand. The undead could not be stopped. They could only be controlled. The revolution had changed. Now, it was not just America against Britain. Now, it was the living against the dead. Now, it was a war on three fronts. And only one side would survive. By 1777, the Americans were no longer just survivors, they were masters of the dead. What had once been a curse was now a weapon. Through trial and error, through sheer necessity, the colonies had learned the patterns, the weaknesses, the behaviors of these creatures. They knew how to draw them out, how to lure them away, how to destroy them completely when needed. But more importantly, they knew how to use them. The rise of America's new power. At first, the idea had been simple: turn the undead against the British. That alone had been effective beyond belief. Every engagement where the British tried to fight in traditional lines of battle ended in massacres. The Redcoats would march in formation, rigid and disciplined, and they would be swallowed whole before their second volley. Every city they tried to hold, every fort they dug into, every town they occupied, all of it was bait for something far worse than muskets and cannons. But as the months passed, some of the colonists began to see the bigger picture. If they could control them here, if they could guide them like a force of nature, if they could harness them, then why stop at just driving the British from America? Why stop at defense when they could go on the offensive? Why stop at independence when they could reshape the world? The horrors of 1778, America's new army. By the time the British fully understood what was happening, it was too late. The Americans had experimented, had adapted, had weaponized something no other nation could even comprehend yet. They had learned to bait the dead with sound, with movement, with sacrificial livestock left in key locations to guide hordes toward their enemies. They had perfected the art of trapping, caging thousands in vast wilderness pens, only to unleash them at the right moment. They had strategies for deployment using the undead as the first wave of any engagement, letting the enemy waste their ammunition before the militia even had to fire a single shot. They had diversion tactics, sacrificial towns, and ghost routes, corridors of wilderness where the dead could be funneled like a tidal wave of rotting flesh, smashing into whatever unfortunate army stood in the way. By late 1778, the colonies were no longer fighting for survival. They were conquering. Every British stronghold in the colonies. Flooded. Every supply chain. Severed. Every attempt to reinforce their numbers. turned into a self-feeding disaster. Britain could not send fresh troops fast enough to replace the men being eaten alive and reanimated within hours. And then came the realization. Why stop at just driving out the British? America's nightmare future, the unstoppable superpower. By 1779, the New World Order was starting to take shape. America was no longer just a nation seeking independence. It was a nightmare state, a colony turned hyperpower with a weapon no empire on Earth could match. The British had failed because they had refused to adapt. The Americans had won because they did. Now, the rest of the world had to ask a terrifying question. What happens when a country controls something that can never die? Because now, it wasn't just about getting Britain off their shores. Now, it wasn't just about protecting themselves. Now, it was about who the real rulers of the world would be. The Americans had built a new kind of army. One that didn't need food. One that didn't tire. One that only grew stronger with every battle won. And they were starting to look at more than just their own lands. Because across the ocean, Europe had no idea what was coming for them. The world had been afraid of the British Empire. Now, they would learn to fear something much, much worse. The world had always watched the American colonies with curiosity, wondering if they would truly revolt, if they would ever become more than just a rebellious extension of the British Empire. Now, they watched with fear. By 1780, the war was no longer just between the British and the Americans. It was something else entirely. The colonies had not only survived against the dead, they had mastered them. What had once been seen as a cursed land, a place where survival was questionable, was now becoming a monster in its own right. The rest of the world had no illusions about what this meant. The British had always been feared. Their navy ruled the waves. Their empire stretched across continents. But even at the height of their power, even with their armies spanning the globe, they had never controlled something like this. This was no longer about muskets and line formations. The Americans had created something far worse than any empire could hope to counter. France had been toying with the idea of supporting the colonies, of stepping in to strike at their old enemy Britain when they were at their weakest. But when news of Philadelphia spread, when word reached Paris that the Americans had sent an entire ship of the dead to English shores, the enthusiasm died overnight. No one wanted to aid a cause that had become something unnatural. There was no place in diplomacy for an army that could not die. Spain, once eager to see Britain weakened, immediately backed off. They withdrew their spies, cut all contact with revolutionary sympathizers in the colonies, and sealed their ports to any American ships. It was better to have no part in this war at all than to risk drawing the attention of a country that now held death itself on a leash. In the courts of Madrid and Paris, quiet discussions were held behind locked doors. The colonies had gone from an interesting rebellion to a genuine threat to civilization itself. The world had expected to watch an empire crumble, not for a new one to rise in its place. In South America, whispers spread among the Spanish territories. Could the Americans send the dead there too? Could they direct them, the same way they had done against the British? What would happen if the colonies grew too powerful, too hungry for expansion? The Spanish viceroys didn't wait to find out. Any discussion of an alliance was immediately silenced. The Americans could have their war. South America would not be part of it. But not every country was afraid. Across the world, in the courts of Prussia, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, new ideas began to spread. If the Americans had discovered a way to control the dead, if they had turned it into a weapon, then perhaps there was something to learn from them. Perhaps this was not a horror, but an opportunity. In London, the British were still in denial. They refused to believe what had happened in Portsmouth, even as their cities fell one by one to the very creatures they claimed didn't exist. The king's advisors told him this was all colonial trickery, that there was no such thing as the dead walking, that the war could still be won. They believed, foolishly, that their superior numbers, their resources, their navy, would still crush the rebellion. But deep down, in the heart of Britain, in the back rooms of Parliament, in the panicked whispers of officers who had seen it firsthand, the truth was undeniable. The British had always believed themselves untouchable. Now, they were under siege. The Americans had become something else. And the world had to decide: stand with them, or stand against them. The world now feared the Americans, and the Americans were eager to show them why they should be afraid. Canada had always been seen as an afterthought in the war. In our time, it remained under British control, its vast wilderness untouched by the flames of revolution. But in this timeline, with the undead as an unstoppable force, the colonies saw an opportunity. The British forces stationed in Canada were already stretched thin, desperately trying to reinforce their holdings while the American militias waged war to the south. When word of the undead reached them, they dismissed it as panic, as superstition, as yet another excuse from the rebels to justify their treason. That mistake cost them everything. The Americans didn't need to send an army. They sent the dead. From New York, from Pennsylvania, from the edges of the frontier, they gathered the hordes, baiting them like starving wolves, herding them toward the north. The British had thought themselves safe in the cold, that the creatures would freeze in the harsh winter of the Canadian wilderness. But the dead do not feel the cold. The first to fall was Montreal. The city, one of the most important strongholds in British Canada, had been preparing for an invasion by men. They had built defenses, stored supplies, trained their men to repel muskets and bayonets. But nothing could prepare them for what came instead. The attack did not come at dawn with the sound of cannon fire. It came in silence. One night, they simply arrived. Pale figures in the snow, hundreds of them at first, then thousands, then tens of thousands. They didn't charge. They didn't storm the walls like an army. They waited. The British, confused, sent men to investigate, thinking it was another American trick, another attempt at intimidation. The moment they opened the gates, Montreal was lost. By the time the British realized what was happening, the city had already turned into a slaughterhouse. Soldiers abandoned their posts, their weapons useless against an enemy that did not bleed, did not stop, did not fear their gunfire. Entire families fled into the wilderness, hoping to escape, only to find themselves trapped between the dead and the frozen void of the north. Ottawa fell next. Then Halifax. Then, within weeks, every major city in British Canada was either abandoned or overrun. The Americans didn't even need to fight for it. They simply let the dead do their work. Those who survived fled westward, deeper into the wilderness, or to the last remaining British strongholds along the Hudson Bay. But there were few ships left, and no one willing to take them. Britain had closed its ports, unwilling to accept refugees carrying whatever curse had taken their soldiers overseas. And as the snow melted and spring arrived, the Americans marched in. There was no war for Canada. There was no great battle, no last stand. There was only the inevitable. The Americans claimed the land without a fight. The British, their empire rotting from within, could not stop them. Canada was gone. North America belonged to the Americans. And the world watched in horror, realizing that this was just the beginning. As the world burned and the American colonies reshaped the battlefield, a new nation was born. The war for independence had ended in a way no one could have ever predicted. The British had been driven out, devoured, or reduced to isolated strongholds that would not last the next winter. Canada had fallen with almost no resistance, and now the Americans stood on the precipice of something greater than freedom. They were not just a country anymore. They were a force of nature. With victory secured, the Founding Fathers gathered, just as they had in our own time, to forge the Constitution of the United States of America. It was, in many ways, the same document that we know: a declaration of liberty, of rights, of a government of the people, by the people, for the people. But in this timeline, there was one crucial addition. No foreign power, no outside force, no uninvited nation shall step foot upon American soil. Any violation of this law shall be met with the full, unrelenting force of the undead. It was a warning to the world. The British had learned the hard way what happened when they underestimated this new nation. No other empire, no other kingdom, no other power would be given the chance to make the same mistake. As the years passed, America grew not just in size, but in knowledge. The undead, once a plague, had become the foundation of their dominion. They had fought them. They had studied them. They had harnessed them. In the darkest corners of the land, deep in the forests, beneath the earth in unnatural ruins, the Americans discovered something terrifying. The undead did not simply rise from nowhere. There were places, sites where the dead emerged, where they regenerated, where they crawled forth from the very ground as if the land itself rejected the living. These sites, once feared, were now contained, controlled, weaponized. With careful study, with experimentation that would make the rest of the world shudder, the Americans learned how to summon them, how to guide them, how to perfectly direct them as an extension of their own might. Soon, no army in the world could stand against them. The undead were no longer just a curse. They were now the ultimate deterrent. America had no need for a standing army in the traditional sense. The great powers of Europe still fielded men in bright uniforms, still built warships, still clung to the old ways of war. But America had legions of soldiers who could not die. And they were waiting for the moment that the world forgot the warning. Waiting for the day when some foolish empire tested their resolve. Waiting to be unleashed once more. The world was terrified of America. And rightfully so. By 1812, America had already solidified itself as the dominant force in North America. No European power dared to challenge it. The British had learned their lesson, their empire forever scarred by the horrors unleashed upon them. France and Spain had turned their backs on the continent, choosing fearful isolation over war. The world had seen what happened when a nation crossed the Americans, and they had no interest in sharing Britain's fate. But not everyone understood the warning. The United States, ever expanding, had reached the southern borders of Spanish-controlled Mexico. Tensions had grown over the years, disputes over land, trade, and the presence of Americans settling deeper into territory once ruled by the Spanish. But Spain was not the enemy this time. Spain had abandoned much of its control over Mexico, leaving a new government, a fledgling Mexican republic, to fend for itself against a rising superpower they did not yet fully understand. The war began over a border dispute. Mexico, newly independent and still struggling to assert its authority, believed it could hold its ground against the Americans. They did not see themselves as weak. They had won their independence from Spain. They had a military. They had thousands of soldiers. They believed they could stand against any invading force. They forgot what America was. The war was over before it even started. It did not begin with armies marching, nor did it start with political negotiations collapsing. No, it began in silence, on the edge of the Rio Grande. A single Mexican garrison, a force of 2,000 men stationed near the disputed border town of Matamoros, went silent. No alarms. No distress calls. Nothing. When reinforcements arrived, they found nothing but blood. There were no bodies. No survivors. No signs of a battle. Just a trail of crimson leading into the desert. The second force, believing it was a guerrilla attack, dug in and prepared for war. They lasted 3 days. On the third night, something came out of the dark. It was not the American army. It was not a cavalry charge, nor a volley of muskets. It was the dead. The Americans had long perfected their methods. There was no need for direct confrontation. They had learned long ago how to direct the tide of undeath, how to send the hordes precisely where they needed them to go. Mexico did not stand a chance. The first official battle of the war ended in less than an hour. By morning, the American flag flew over the ruined garrison. Over the next 6 weeks, city after city fell without a fight. Some tried to hold out, but it was pointless. They did not face soldiers. They did not face men. They faced an unstoppable force, a tide of reanimated horror, controlled, guided, and weaponized with terrifying efficiency. By the time the last remnants of the Mexican government fled Mexico City, the Americans had already won. There was no treaty, no negotiations, no last stand. The War of 1812 was over before the world even knew it had begun. America had expanded once more. And the world saw yet again why no nation, no empire, no army would ever stand against them. Not all Americans stood behind the growing power of their nation. For years, there had been whispers, concerns in the dark corners of taverns, in hushed conversations in the back rooms of government buildings. There were those who looked upon the new America, the empire built not on industry or diplomacy, but on death itself, and saw a monster. At first, these voices were small. A few dissenters. A few murmurs of unrest. But as America expanded further and further, as more lands fell under its control without a single human battle, the fear grew. This was no longer the land of freedom and democracy that had once been envisioned. This was something else. The final breaking point came in the 1840s. By then, America stretched from coast to coast. Mexico was gone, absorbed into the ever-expanding territories of the United States. The British, long since humiliated, had retreated from what was left of Canada. The land was undisputed, a continent ruled by men who had mastered the dead. And now America turned inward. The cities were thriving. Trade was booming. Innovation in technology, in medicine, in industry, all pushed forward by a nation no longer constrained by war. But there were those who still feared what had been created. In secret, they gathered. In basements, in barns, in hidden valleys far from the reach of Washington. They called themselves true sons of liberty, a name that spat in the face of what their government had become. They believed that America had gone too far, that the weaponization of the undead was an abomination against God and nature. Some were former military officers who had once served in the early wars, men who had seen what happened to those who stood in America's way. Others were civilians, common men, and women who refused to live in a world where death itself was no longer sacred. At first, the government ignored them. Then they protested. Then they fought back. The first recorded skirmish of the Neo-Civil War occurred in 1846, in what was once Virginia. A group of militia rebels attacked a government-controlled outpost, a facility designed to house and manage the undead hordes that America now used as both military force and labor. They burned it to the ground. Within a week, more facilities were destroyed. The government responded swiftly and mercilessly. Those who opposed the nation's rule were not just labeled rebels. They were traitors. The punishments were swift. Entire towns were razed if they harbored insurgents. Whole families were executed for assisting the resistance. Yet, the rebels did not stop. Over the next 2 decades, small uprisings would ignite across the nation. None of them large enough to break the government's hold, but all of them reminders that not everyone had accepted what America had become. Washington refused to acknowledge them as a true war. But everyone knew what this was. This was America fighting itself. Not over slavery. Not over states' rights. But over the very soul of the nation. By the 1870s, the last known rebellious strongholds had been wiped out. The government stood victorious, but at a cost. The message had been made clear: there would be no resistance to the new America. The world, watching from afar, saw what happened to those who opposed the undead empire. And they knew, with chilling certainty, that if even Americans could not stop it, no one could. The world had watched America's Neo-Civil War with horror, but none of them dared intervene. For decades, they had lived in fear of the growing undead empire, wary of provoking it. But when America turned on its own citizens, when it wiped out entire towns to silence dissent, when it showed the world that not even its own people were safe, something changed. The governments of Europe could no longer ignore it. The Ottoman Empire, the remnants of Spain, the reborn French Republic, even the shattered remains of the once mighty British Empire, they all saw the writing on the wall. America was too powerful. It had become something that should not exist, a nation that had not just conquered death but had turned it into an extension of its will. They knew, eventually, America would turn its gaze beyond its own borders. So, in 1889, alliances were formed. For the first time in history, the entire world stood together against a single enemy. They called themselves the Coalition of the Living. They believed that if they acted swiftly, if they stood together, they could finally break the hold America had over the continent. They had forgotten one thing. America did not need to invade to win. They only needed to show what happened to those who defied them. And so, they did not turn to Europe. They did not sail across the Atlantic. They looked south. South America, once free from American control, had stood quietly, watching, never daring to intervene. Its governments had distanced themselves from the growing empire, trying to stay neutral in the global conflict forming around them. That ended overnight. In 1891, without warning, the undead tide was set loose upon the continent. The process was swift and brutal. America had spent decades mastering its control over the dead, refining its techniques, perfecting its methods. South America had no defense against it. They did not fight an army. They fought waves of flesh, swarming cities, flooding valleys, turning entire nations into nothing but echoes of what they once were. Buenos Aires fell in a matter of days. Brazil lasted only a week. Chile never even had time to form a response. Within 2 years, all of South America was under American control. And the world understood the message. This was not an empire that sought land for power. It was an empire that existed as a reminder to all who lived. America had not set out to conquer the world. But now the world knew if they ever tried to fight, this is what would happen to them. There was no stopping it. The First World War had begun. And America had already won. The First World War raged across the globe, but it was never a war that could be won by anyone except America. Europe, Africa, and Asia had all united against the undead empire, throwing everything they had at it. And, for a time, they held the line. The dead had never spread across the ocean on their own, and they believed that, if they could keep them contained, if they could keep America locked behind its borders, they might just have a chance. But they had underestimated just how much the Americans had perfected their control. The first major battle outside of the Americas took place in Australia in 1895. The coalition of the living had chosen the continent as a fortress, believing that its isolation and natural defenses would make it a stronghold. They filled its shores with British, German, and Ottoman forces, desperate to turn it into the one place the undead could not reach. The Americans did not invade. They sent one ship. One rotting, plague-ridden hulk, packed with thousands of the dead, set loose upon Sydney Harbour. The Australians and their allies fought with everything they had, sinking the ship before it could dock, burning it before the cargo could fully escape. But it only took one corpse, washed ashore. One soldier, infected before he even realized it. One bite, spreading through an entire continent in weeks. By 1896, Australia was abandoned. The same happened in Russia in 1897. The great empire of the Tsars, vast and resilient, tried to fight the way they had fought for centuries with overwhelming numbers, brutal cold, and sheer endurance. But the dead did not care for winter. The dead did not care for starvation. And when the Russians retreated deeper into their own land, hoping to escape, they only brought the infection with them. Moscow fell within a month. The last great stand happened in China in 1899. The Qing dynasty, alongside the last remnants of the coalition, gathered its largest army in history, millions of soldiers prepared to die before they let the undead take them. America never sent a single soldier. They sent the tide. The battle lasted a year. China, the last nation truly standing, held out longer than anyone else. Millions died fighting in the mountains, in the valleys, in the endless cities of their empire. And yet, in the end, it was never enough. By 1901, the war was over. The world had lost. But America did not destroy them. They did not take the land. They simply made one thing very clear. The world belonged to them. Now, every nation paid tribute to the United States of America. Gold, resources, manpower. It did not matter. Every nation had a price to pay. If they paid it, they were left alone. If they refused, they became the next state. No one dared resist. Not after Mexico. Not after South America. Not after Australia, Russia, and China. The message had been made clear. America was not a country anymore. It was the world's new god. By the 1930s, the world had long since accepted its new order. America ruled, and everyone else paid tribute. But not everyone accepted it quietly. Small groups, hidden in the shadows of their ruined nations, whispered of resistance, of the world before America, of a future without the undead looming over them. They were fools. What they called the Second World War was never a war at all. It was desperation, a series of fragmented rebellions, isolated uprisings, doomed revolts in the night. These weren't nations rising up against tyranny. These were remnants, radicals, desperate souls clinging to a world that no longer existed. They stole weapons. They stole resources. Some even stole ships, hoping to sail across the oceans and retake what they believed had been lost. And for a moment, for a brief, fleeting moment, they thought they had a chance. Because America, for all its power, did not react immediately. And so, when the first of these groups landed on the shores of Florida, they believed they had done the impossible. They had taken land from the empire of the dead. But America did not see them as an enemy. America did not see them as a threat. They saw them as an example. They did not send armies. They did not send fleets. They did not send the living. They sent something worse. Because America had spent the last 70 years learning. They had studied the undead. They had controlled them. And now, they had learned how to make more. The rebels who had landed in Florida, they were never fighting to survive. They were being turned into something else. Their bodies were found in the streets, not as corpses, but as something unrecognizable. They had been changed, altered. No longer just rotting, mindless husks, but something worse, something that still remembered what it was, still knew who it had been, but was no longer in control. It was a fate worse than death. And then America gave its warning to the world. This was a mistake. This was a test of our patience. There will not be another. If any group, from any nation, ever raises a hand against us again, that nation will not become a state. That nation will become something else. something that will never die. And the world listened. Because America had never been a country. America had become a force beyond comprehension. And now, every nation knew. It was not the living they had to fear. It was what America could turn them into. The world no longer belonged to the living. It belonged to America, and America had become something far beyond an empire. By the time the Second World War, or what little there was of it, ended, the entire planet understood that the United States was not just a country. It was a force of nature. There were no more wars, not really. There were no more alliances between nations, no military coalitions, no global powers trying to outpace one another. There was only survival under the rule of the dead. From 1950 onward, history no longer unfolded in the way it once did. There was no Cold War. There was no race for nuclear arms. There was only fear, and the desperate struggle of other nations to keep America satisfied so that they would never be forced to witness what had happened to South America, Australia, Russia, and China. 1950s to 1970s, the era of submission. The world settled into a new normal. Nations still existed in name, but they were nothing more than tributary states, providing resources, wealth, and knowledge to keep themselves alive. America never bothered to expand further. They didn't need to. They had perfected control over the undead, and that was more powerful than any army, more devastating than any bomb. Small, isolated rebellions still surfaced, groups who had forgotten what fear truly meant, but they were erased from history before their movements could ever spread. The process was always the same. At first, America warned them. If they persisted, America reminded them. And if they still refused, America made them into something else. This was the fate worse than death, a process now so refined that entire cities could be turned overnight into something that no longer belonged to the living, but was not truly dead, either. It happened in Warsaw in 1958. It happened in Cairo in 1963. It happened in Istanbul in 1971. And by 1980, there was no one left willing to resist. 1980s to 1990s, the golden age of the undead empire. With the world completely under its rule, America entered a new era. Technology flourished not in warfare, but in perfection of control. The undead were no longer just a weapon. They became a workforce, a tool, a resource unlike any other. By the mid-80s, America had developed ways to fully integrate the undead into society. They were used in factories, in agriculture, in labor forces too dangerous for the living. Entire industries flourished, powered by an endless workforce that never tired, never aged, never needed rest. While the rest of the world paid tribute, America grew stronger, wealthier, more advanced than any civilization in history. It was an era of absolute domination. There were no wars. There were no conflicts. There was only obedience. By the time the year 2000 arrived, America was so powerful that the rest of the world had completely lost any identity beyond it. There was no global economy. Only America's economy. There was no military conflict. Only the enforcement of America's laws. There was no rebellion. Only the consequences of defiance. 2000s to 2018, the era of the undying. The world was now completely reshaped. In 2005, America developed a way to sustain the undead indefinitely. They no longer decayed beyond control. This meant permanence. This meant the first truly eternal empire in history. By 2010, America had developed a way to produce more undead at will, rather than relying on the naturally occurring sites they had discovered centuries ago. The balance of power had ended. There was no longer a question of who ruled the earth. There was only America. By 2018, there was nothing left to resist. The entire planet was now a machine that existed solely to feed the undead empire. All borders were meaningless. All governments were figureheads. All nations were nothing but tributary states under the unchallenged dominion of the United States of America. The world was no longer about the living. The world now belonged to the dead. By 2020, America was rotting from within. For centuries, it had ruled unchallenged, its dominion over the world absolute. The undead, once a necessity for survival, had become a pillar of the empire, an untiring, unquestioning workforce, an army that never faltered, a means of ensuring perpetual control. But now, the very people who had once embraced this power had begun to turn against it. For decades, the American people had lived without challenge, basking in the comfort of supremacy. But as technology advanced, as machines replaced labor, as AI and automation began handling what the undead once had, the need for the dead began to vanish. The younger generations, raised in a world where America had no rival, no war to fight, began to question why they were still forced to live under a system built for conquest and war. What had once been a necessity had become a burden. Protests started small. At first, they were petitions, quiet debates held in universities, whispers in underground forums. But soon, those whispers turned into voices, and those voices turned into crowds. The first major demonstration happened in Seattle, 2023. Thousands gathered in the streets, demanding change. Not war. Not destruction. Just change. The undead are obsolete. Technology has replaced them. We don't need them anymore. It was peaceful. It lasted 4 hours before the city was erased. Not just put down, erased. The people turned into the very thing they had protested. The city itself, reduced to an uninhabitable ruin, forever marked as a place that had dared to challenge the empire. This was the warning. It did not work. Because the world had changed. The empire had been built on fear. But what happens when fear begins to fade? What happens when an empire has lasted too long? More protests erupted. More cities vanished. More people were turned. But for every city that fell, for every protest wiped out, more people took up the cause. They no longer feared the government. They no longer feared the undead. They had lived in this world long enough to understand what it was. And they had made their decision. For the first time since the Neo-Civil War, America was truly divided. Not by politics. Not by territory. But by ideology. This was no longer just a protest movement. This was something far, far worse. This was the beginning of the end.